The day begins in the dark. There is no alarm, no phone buzz, no soft blue light from an LED clock, just the sound of roosters far off, like a memory of noise. A cartwheel groans somewhere, wood creaks, rain on thatch, and then, perhaps, silence again. You lie still beneath a wool blanket, not soft, but heavy, smelling faintly of lanolin and the long breath of sleep. The mattress beneath you is made of straw, flattened and lumpy now, rustling gently as you shift your weight. One more morning, one more year. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, there is no soap, there is no toothpaste, there is no sink, and no one misses these things. Not really, because they were never there. Eyes open slowly. The light is gray. Smoke from the hearth hangs in the air like a fog that didn't leave. You slept in your clothes again. Your only tunic, a little damp still from the last wash, weeks ago. It smells of sweat and wood smoke and earth, and so does everything else. Even your own hands. Your face feels tight, a little oily. Your eyes, gummy with the pale crust of sleep, are wiped not with a warm cloth, but just with your fingers, rubbed away with the back of your hand. That's all. That's enough. Some splash cold water from a basin. Just a handful. A quick rinse, maybe, but not all do. In winter, the water bites the skin. You might decide against it. The cold lingers longer than the dirt. There's a sense that to bathe too often is indulgent, or strange, or even suspicious. Somewhere in a richer home, a servant might carry in a bowl of warmed water. Steam will rise faintly, slowly, and disappear into the chill of the room. A linen cloth will be dabbed along the brow and neck, gently, absently, out of routine, not ambition. And then, as quickly as it began, the ritual is done. You are ready for the day. There are no toothbrushes, no bristles, no mint, no foam, only the lingering taste of sleep, faintly metallic or sour. A mouth uncleaned for days, weeks, or even longer. It isn't remarked upon, it isn't even noticed. Some may rinse with wine or vinegar, just a swish and a spit into the hearth ashes. Perhaps chew a mint leaf, parsley, fennel seed. But mostly the breath is simply what it is. Warm, close, human. Teeth ache and rot quietly in the background of life, rarely mentioned. A wooden toothpick might be used by firelight, maybe, if one is available, but not many people have one. Still, mouths smile. Still, people speak. You notice it less when everyone smells the same. Hair is hair, oily or not, combed sometimes with a wooden comb or fingers, covered with a linen coif, or a felted wool cap, or a veil. Not for fashion, though there is always a little pride, but for warmth and modesty and for covering up what water could not fix. The scalp itches sometimes, that's expected. A scratch here and there, the hair stays flattened, pressed, unwashed for long stretches of the year. Grease gathers slowly like a soft wax at the roots. Dust sticks, that's just how it is. They used to believe water could make you sick, that washing too much let illness in through the skin. So many preferred to keep the body dry, the hair untouched, or powdered faintly with herbs, rose petals, lavender, crushed rosemary, but mostly they did nothing, because there was always something else to do instead. The clothes are the same as yesterday and the day before. And likely tomorrow, there is only one tunic, maybe two if you're fortunate. One being patched as the other is worn. The fabric is wool. It is always wool, a little itchy, a little damp, never quite dry in the winter air. The underclothes are linen when there are any at all. Often, there are none. The feet slip into stiff leather shoes, or wooden clogs. They chafe, they always chafe. Socks may be made of rags or not at all. Rushes cover the floor, old, soft, flattened, with dried herbs and bits of hay to help disguise the smell of the chamber pot, emptied yesterday, or the day before, or not at all. Everything smells faintly of smoke, of wool, of body. But slowly, gently, your nose adjusts, and nothing smells like anything at all. The room is dim, a single window maybe, shuttered at night to keep out the cold. There is no glass, only a wooden panel, or a scrap of oiled cloth. The air is close. It smells of hearth ash and unwashed breath, and the last evening's stew. Cabbage, perhaps an onion. The warmth from the fire does not reach the corners of the room. The floor is cold. Your feet find it with a small wince, and then acceptance. That's how mornings feel. You don't stretch. There is no yoga. No soft bed to linger in. You rise because the day has already started, even if it hasn't. There are animals to tend, bread to knead, fields to walk, slowly, with heavy boots and aching feet, and dirt under the fingernails that never truly comes out. This is the morning. This is the moment where cleanliness meant very little. Where being clean was not the goal, but being not too dirty was enough. Where the sound of water was rare and sacred, and the smell of yourself was the smell of everyone else. A wool-wrapped world of mild discomfort, endured without complaint. This is not grotesque. This is not horrifying. This is simply what was, how it was. A culture not of filth, but of resignation, of ritual, of rhythm. Because there is something beautifully slow about not rushing to clean, about sitting with the self as it is, body, odor, cloth, and all, and calling it ordinary. No soap, no toothbrush, no shame. And still, people lived. People laughed, sat close, held hands, shared bites from the same spoon, whispered in the same small rooms with the same breath and the same skin. The cleanliness we imagine now wasn't missing. It simply hadn't been invented. They didn't know what they didn't have. And in a strange, sleepy way, that might have been easier. And now the day continues. But some things still need cleaning. Clothes, eventually. Tunics must be washed. Linen must be beaten on rocks by the river. It is work, cold work, wet, tiring work. So it is put off and put off again. But eventually, even in the Middle Ages, laundry had to be done. And that is where we'll go next. Washing day did not come often, and when it did, it came slowly, like a chore remembered too late. In the Middle Ages, clothes were not changed each day, nor were they washed weekly. They were worn, day after day, as the weather shifted and the body warmed and cooled beneath them. Wool held the shape of the person who wore it, absorbing the scent of skin, the traces of smoke, of food, of everything lived in. Washing them was a task so large, so inconvenient, so cold and heavy and wet, that most people simply didn't bother until they truly had to. And even then, they hesitated. To wash a tunic, or more often, to wash the simple linen shift worn beneath the tunic, required time, space, and water. But not water from a tap or a warm basin. There were no laundry rooms. There were no gentle soaps. Washing meant walking, often far to a river or stream, carrying garments stiff with wear, folded tightly into bundles, smelling faintly of the life lived inside them. The washer would kneel on slick stone or soft mud, knees damp and aching before the first cloth was unfolded. Cold water, always cold, even in springtime, would lap around the ankles or soak into shoes. The wind would carry droplets back into the face, numbing fingers and cheekbones alike. The garments were soaked in water, sometimes just water alone, and other times with the sharp sting of lye, a harsh ash-based cleanser, made by slowly dripping water through wood ash collected from the hearth. This mixture was not gentle, it was not good for the skin, but it lifted grease and odor, or at least loosened them enough to believe the job was done. Clothes would be beaten against rocks or wooden boards, slapped and folded and struck again and again, the sound echoing over quiet countryside like muffled thunder. The cloth did not become white. Whiteness wasn't expected, but perhaps it grew a little lighter, a little less stiff, a little less visibly marked by daily grime. For those with money, laundering might be left to a servant or a washerwoman, often one who carried out her labor beside many others, at a communal riverbank or public fountain. It was work marked by chatter and repetition. A rhythm of slapping cloth and shared complaints, of hands gone red and raw, of backs bent for hours, shoulders curled against wind. In towns, clotheslines stretched from window to window like tired flags. Linen flapped in the breeze, sometimes catching soot from the chimney or dust from the road before it could dry. Everything smelled of outside. There was no crisp scent of detergent, no softness to the fibers, only the faint smell of ash and sometimes herbs, If a sachet had been tucked into the garment before storage. Maybe rosemary, maybe thyme. But for many, laundry was simply rare. Outer garments, especially wool ones, were seldom washed at all. They were brushed, beaten with a stick, aired in the wind. If they were soiled, the dirt was scraped gently, the stain dabbed. A dry cloth, a bit of stale bread, rubbed against the spot. These were small tricks, known and passed down. But mostly, a tunic would be worn until it needed patching more than cleaning. Stains became part of the garment's story. The smell of a person clung to their clothes like breath to a window pane, always there and fading only with time. Underclothes, when worn, were treated with slightly more care. Linen shirts and shifts were lighter, easier to scrub, quicker to dry. They sat close to the skin, absorbing the sweat, the oils, the quiet weariness of the body beneath. Washing them made a difference, though not always a visible one. The same shift might be worn for days, even weeks, before being cleaned. Women washed menstrual cloths by hand in secret, under cover of early morning or deep night. These were private rituals, not spoken of openly, but done nonetheless. Clean was a matter of degrees and privacy. In the colder months, laundry might be put off until absolutely necessary. Water froze in the basins. Fingers split at the knuckles. Clothes, once washed, could stiffen solid before they dried, so people waited. They layered dirty garments over older ones, adding warmth and trapping scent. The air inside a home held it all. The breath of bodies, the musk of wool, the lingering notes of sweat and cooking and smoke, and everyone was used to it. Everyone wore the same quiet film of discomfort. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just background, a sort of fabric that wrapped itself around life. Even when the clothes were finally clean, they were not soft. They dried in the open air, stiff and pale, sometimes warped from the weight of water. They scratched at the skin when first worn again. And yet, there was satisfaction. The small relief of clean linen against the body, a faint difference in weight, a shift less clingy, a tunic that breathed just slightly better. These were things to be noticed in passing, not celebrated, just noted. There were no wardrobes full of options, no seasonal reorganizing. The same garments were worn year-round, patched and mended, passed down, reshaped. Washing was not about freshness, it was about necessity. When dirt made the fabric heavy, when the smell became unbearable even to one's own nose, when stains threatened to become permanent, then came the washing. But only then, because it took a day, sometimes two. And during that time, you might have nothing to wear at all. So most people waited, and chose not to care. No one walked past you with the sharp, sterile smell of laundered cotton. No one had ever known that scent. If you smelled at all, it was of the fire, or the fields, or the herbs you tucked into your belt pouch to mask the more human notes. If someone noticed a smell, they said nothing. It wasn't impolite, it wasn't anything. It was just how life was. Close, heavy, full. And so the days passed, and laundry came only when it must. Clothes were worn until they could not be worn again. Then they were washed. Then they were worn again. And the cycle spun slowly forward like a mill wheel turning in a sleepy stream. Not rushing, never rushing, just moving along at the pace of breath and need. The rivers still remember. The stones by the edge, worn smooth from years of cloth and knuckle and lie. The air in those places always held the smell of ash and damp wool, of women's voices half lost in the splash and hush of water. And even now, in the stillness of evening, it's easy to imagine a shift flapping lazily on a line stretched between trees, and a tired figure rubbing her hands dry, knuckles chapped, eyes soft with the dull peace of something completed. The clothes were never fully clean. Not in the way we would wish, but they were cleaner than before. And that was enough. Enough at least until the next bath day. But bathing was something else entirely. And that's where we'll go next. Bathing in the Middle Ages was not a daily act. Not even weekly. It came and went like a passing season. Sometimes celebrated, sometimes feared, often postponed. To bathe was not something you did quickly in the privacy of your home. It was not a matter of warm tiles and steamy mirrors and soft towels. It was a ritual, an event. A slow and awkward kind of cleansing, tangled up with community and silence and at times suspicion. Some people bathed once a month, some once a year, others when it seemed necessary, or when invited, or when the opportunity finally arrived. Most did not wake up and reach for a bar of soap, because soap, as we think of it now, did not truly exist. A block of lye and animal fat might do in its place, gritty and caustic, more fit for laundry than for skin. So instead, water was trusted to do most of the work, and in most homes there was no tub. Just a basin, a bucket, a wooden barrel if you were fortunate, and a cloth that never fully dried between uses. The rich might own a bathing vessel, a large wooden tub that stood alone in a corner of a drafty room. It would be filled by hand, kettle after kettle of warmed water brought from the hearth. It took hours, sometimes a whole day, and by the time the last bucket was poured, the first had gone cold. So you sat quickly, or you waited patiently, or you learned to tolerate the chill. But for most people, true bathing happened not in the home, but at the bathhouse. That is, when the bathhouse still held its place in town. These spaces, which flourished in certain medieval cities and quietly disappeared in others, were not spas, not temples of self-care, but quiet wooden rooms with hot water, rising steam, and long benches stained by years of skin and heat and time. At first, they were communal and unremarkable. Men and women often bathed together, modestly or not, depending on region, custom, or decade. No one thought much of it. The water was heated in great cauldrons. Baths were shared. Wooden tubs lined the walls or sat in rows in the center of the room. You might rent a towel or bring your own cloth, rough from use and faded from age. You might bathe alone, or with your children, or with strangers, or with a midwife who rubbed your back with oil and scraped dirt from your skin with a dull blade made for the task. But no matter the configuration, one fact remained the same. The water did not change. The first bather had clear warmth. The second, warmth with a trace of skin. The third, water tinted with oil and clouded with silence. The fourth and fifth, well, they bathed more in spirit than in substance. Still, there was a comfort in it, a heaviness to the steam. The air was warm, and that alone was something worth paying for. Outside, the world was cold and rough. In the bathhouse, it was close and strange, but gentle. People spoke quietly, or not at all. The sound of water covered most conversation. And when the bath ended, you dried yourself as best you could, perhaps in front of a fire, perhaps with the same damp linen you'd used last time. You dressed again in the same clothes you'd worn in, now feeling rougher against your newly clean skin, and stepped out into the street with your hair still wet, face pink from scrubbing, uncertain if you felt better, or simply different. There were those who bathed more often. Monks, in some orders, were given baths once a month, sometimes more. Rich merchants might build their own baths and bathe whenever it pleased them. Kings had bath attendants. Queens were rubbed with rose oil and almond milk and sat in wooden tubs lined with linen, the water perfumed with crushed herbs. But these were the few. For most, bathing was occasional and public and far from indulgent. It was warm, yes, but also heavy, quiet, full of the soft discomfort of other bodies and the long stillness of hot water that was never quite clean. And slowly, the bathhouse began to change. Over time, as ideas shifted and fears grew, the bathhouse began to collect a reputation. Cleanliness was joined by something else, something whispered about. Intimacy, scandal, the steam concealed things that many preferred not to see. And so slowly the bathhouse moved out of favor. The church frowned, the streets gossiped, and what had once been a place of shared warmth and occasional cleanliness became something quieter, more secret, more suspect. Some were shuttered, others remained, but changed. And for many, the ritual of bathing drifted back toward the home or vanished entirely. In colder climates, bathing was soon considered a risk. To be wet was to be vulnerable. Clean skin was open skin. The pores, they said, could drink an illness. A hot bath might lead to death. It was better, perhaps, to stay just clean enough. A quick rinse, a cloth scrubbed at the neck, the underarms, the feet. No full immersion. No long soak, no risk. But still, people missed the warmth, missed the water, missed the brief feeling of being not quite so heavy in their own skin. So they found smaller ways. They wiped themselves with damp cloths. They steamed their faces over herbal pots. They bathed their children in shallow basins with water already used once before. Bathing became something pieced together, fragmented. Not a ritual anymore, just an act of maintenance. Something to do when needed, when dirt became too much. When lice were too persistent, when someone important was coming to visit. And so gradually, the image of bathing slipped into the background of medieval life. A sometimes thing, a luxury, a worry, a memory. Yet for those who had once sat in the steam, who had once lowered their tired limbs into the warmth of reused water and felt, if only for a moment, just a little lighter, just a little more themselves, it stayed with them. A kind of stillness, a softness. Not quite cleanliness, but something close. It was never about being fresh, or fragrant, or new. It was just about washing some of the weight away. And when the bath was done, the warmth lingered for a while. But the dirt always returned, quietly, slowly, as it always did. And so we turned next to where the dirt had nowhere to go, and people, quite simply, had to go somewhere else. There are parts of life we don't often think about when we picture the past. We imagine the armor, the cobbled streets, the candles flickering in high windows, but not the chamber pot. Not the wooden bench with the hole cut into it, set over a pit dug just deep enough to forget about, for a little while, and certainly not what came after. Because long before toilet paper, before rolls, before flushes, before privacy, there was only what you had, and what you had was usually not much. A soft cloth if you were rich, a handful of moss if it hadn't rained too hard, a smooth stick, a broken tile, a torn scrap of linen once part of something else. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't even especially clean. But it worked, mostly, and that was the standard. People relieved themselves where they could, behind hedges, in corners of fields, against stone walls in quiet alleys, sometimes squatting over ditches carved into the earth like sleepy canals winding through the edge of town. Outhouses stood behind homes when space allowed. Wooden shacks with slanted roofs, half-rotted doors, the faint scent of rot rising from beneath the floorboards. They were not visited often in the night, not unless you had to. In the dark, the path could be muddy, the air cold, and rats always liked the warmth that lingered. So many kept a chamber pot close instead. A squat vessel made of clay or tin, sometimes with a lid, sometimes not. It sat beneath the bed or beside the hearth. It was used quietly, without ceremony, and emptied when someone remembered. Emptying the pot was unpleasant, but it was done. Sometimes into a larger pit, sometimes into the street. Not all streets had drains, not all homes had pits. And the line between indoors and outdoors was thin, more suggestion than boundary. Waste mingled with mud, with rain, with the straw that lined the floors, flattened and soaked and layered again with fresh rushes that were never quite clean, just newer. You walked across it in shoes or in bare feet and thought little of it. That was simply how floors felt, slightly soft, slightly damp, always changing. In cities, latrines might be communal, shared holes built over running water or stagnant pools, used by dozens, perhaps hundreds. The smell was strong, but steady, predictable. You learned to breathe through your mouth, or to stop noticing. Public bathhouses sometimes had privies nearby, small closets of wood tucked into corners. Monasteries had long rows of them, side by side, where monks sat in silence, robes lifted carefully, doing what needed to be done without acknowledgement. No one spoke of it, no one lingered. It was not shameful, it was not even particularly private. It was simply another part of being human, lived quietly in the shadows of stone walls and hedges. Children used the ground. Old men, too tired to walk the distance, sometimes used doorways or stairs. In the dark, you could relieve yourself almost anywhere if you did it quickly and no one saw. And even if they did, it was rare to be scolded. People understood. Not everything had a proper place, especially not that. And so you stepped carefully. You learned where to look and when not to look at all. For wiping, nothing was standard. Nothing was expected. A handful of straw, a bit of cloth reused many times, a torn page from a book no one read anymore. Rags were washed if they could be, burned if they couldn't. And most people simply didn't talk about what they used. It was a private matter. A small daily discomfort, managed with quiet repetition. If the cloth chafed, you ignored it. If there was nothing to use, you waited or did the best you could with your hand and water. In some places, smooth stones were left by the latrine, rounded from use, like little gray talismans of practicality. In others, moss was prized, soft, absorbent, a rare luxury when dry, but only when dry. Women carried their own discomfort in silence. During their monthly cycles, cloth pads were reused, washed discreetly, dried in shadows. No one asked questions. No one answered them. Stains were scrubbed out with cold water and lye. The cloths were folded, hidden, brought out again next month. And for those without linen, moss was used once more, or nothing at all. Cleanliness was measured differently then. It wasn't about scent or sparkle or sterile smoothness. It was about function. Had the task been done? Had the pot been emptied? Had the cloths been washed? Then yes, one was clean. Clean enough, at least. The body wasn't expected to stay fresh. The air wasn't expected to stay pure. These were not ideas people had yet. To be clean was to have done what was required, no more. And so waste flowed quietly through the cracks of daily life, into corners, into streets, into soil. It mixed with ashes, with rain, with spilled broth and crushed rushes and the slow wearing down of everything underfoot. It didn't smell good, but it didn't smell shocking. It simply smelled like life. And if you lived there long enough, you stopped smelling it at all. Even now, if you close your eyes and walk through a medieval town in your mind, you'll notice the tightness of the streets, the warmth of bodies pressed into narrow passageways, the faint scent of damp wool and yesterday's fire. And beneath that, always faint, always lingering, is the quiet human presence that no one ever mentions. But everyone shares. You walk carefully. You breathe gently. You learn not to ask. There were no air fresheners, no plumbing, no wipes, just the body and the earth and the long ritual of making do. And next we'll visit another part of the body that rarely felt clean, one that exhaled quietly in the dark, without mint or floss or foam, a mouth left to its own slow decay. The mouth wakes up before the rest of the body does. Long before your eyes open, long before your limbs stretch or the fire is stirred or the tunic is pulled over your head again, the mouth is already there, warm, dry, silent. Breathing through the night, swallowing once in a while, holding the memory of the day before. In the Middle Ages, it did not taste of mint. It did not feel fresh. It was not cleaned with paste or bristles or bright synthetic rinse. It was simply left to itself. It was what it was, a living part of the body, imperfect and human, and left more or less alone. There was no toothpaste. Not really. No paste at all. Nothing whipped or foamed or flavored. Nothing squeezed onto a soft brush and moved in circles while music played somewhere in the background. Instead, there were fingers, sometimes cloth, sometimes salt, sometimes ashes, a pinch of something coarse rubbed gently across the teeth if time allowed. But most days there was no time, or no cloth, or no habit. Many people did nothing at all. They rinsed, maybe, swirled cold water in the mouth, spat into the hearth. And that was that. Some used wine or vinegar, not to clean, not exactly, but to rinse, to dull the edge of morning breath, to make speaking more pleasant, or at least less offensive. Vinegar left the mouth sharp and clean feeling, but only for a moment. Wine did the same, though it burned a little, and stained the tongue with a faint purple hue. But in either case, the scent of the mouth returned quickly. Because the decay, the bacteria, the quiet work of time inside the teeth, none of it could be washed away so easily. There were no dentists, not in the way we think of them now. There were people who pulled teeth, barbers sometimes with the same tools used to cut hair, iron pliers, no anesthetic, no warning, just a swift, practiced motion and a coin exchanged afterward. If a tooth ached, you waited. If it swelled, you waited. If it broke or loosened or fell out on its own, you were grateful. Fewer teeth meant fewer problems. Until it didn't. Until eating grew hard. Until the jaw hurt. Until the face swelled in the night and never truly settled again. But no one judged. No one stared. Everyone's teeth were bad eventually. Even kings, even nuns, even children. Cavities were expected. Blackened molars were common. Gaps and aches were part of aging. Sometimes part of youth. Breath smelled of fermentation, of rot, of the slow turning of food into something else. But it was not remarked upon, not even by those closest to you. Not even by lovers, by friends, by family. Because it was simply normal. The smell of the mouth was like the smell of the hearth, faintly sour, a little smoky, sometimes stronger after a meal. It was part of being near someone. Part of living close. Still, people tried. Herbs were chewed. Mint, parsley, fennel, cloves. Not to clean, not exactly, but to soothe. To mask. To feel fresh, just for a moment. Chewing helped. It gave the mouth something to do. The bitterness of mint, the spice of clove, these were welcome, lingering on the breath like a memory of something better. People kept herb bundles in their pockets or tied to their belts. Little pomanders stuffed with rosemary or thyme or dried orange peel. They were not eaten, but they helped in their way. Just holding them near the nose could make the mouth feel cleaner, even if it wasn't. Toothpicks existed, of a sort. Slivers of wood, whittled thin, sometimes carved, sometimes plain. They were used gently, slowly, beside the fire after meals. Not often. Not by everyone. Just those with the patience, or the pain, or the pride. Picking teeth was a quiet act. You did it while listening to others speak, or staring into the coals or preparing to sleep. You did not expect perfection. You just wanted relief from the seed caught between molars, from the ache of a bite that had lingered too long. Sometimes mouths were cleaned with cloth, a rag wrapped around a finger, dipped in vinegar or wine, rubbed slowly over each tooth. This was more common among the wealthy. It was a mark of care, a sign that the body, though difficult, was still worth tending. Some might even use powdered sage or crushed oyster shell or burnt bread. But nothing worked very well. Teeth remained yellow or brown or gray. The breath remained what it was. And still people laughed. Still they kissed. Still they ate together from shared bowls, passing spoons from hand to mouth to hand again. No one expected clean, they expected closeness. And the body was never far away. Children were not taught to brush. There were no songs, no routines, no supervision. Their baby teeth rotted quietly, fell out, and were replaced by adult ones that would do the same, given time. No one tracked dental milestones. No one worried about alignment or whiteness. Teeth were tools, and tools wore down. The fortunate kept them longer. The fortunate suffered a little less. But everyone suffered eventually. And through it all, the mouth remained a mystery. Always working, always warm, always breathing. It chewed, it whispered, it tasted and spoke and spat and swallowed. And no one thought much of what it meant to care for it. It was simply there, present, ongoing. Not clean but not shameful either. Just one more thing the body carried, quietly, patiently, until it didn't. And so life continued. Mouths smiled, laughed, kissed, prayed, ate, and slowly decayed. And while all that went on inside, something else, something smaller, was crawling just under the hairline, just behind the ears, just along the collar. And it itched, softly, always, and no one wanted to talk about it. But we will. The itch arrived slowly, Not suddenly, not all at once, just a faint tickle at the nape of the neck. A warmth under the coif, under the hood, under the veil. A little movement just behind the ear. Not enough to alarm, not enough to speak of, just enough to notice. And once you noticed it, it stayed. You scratched gently, you scratched again, and eventually, you stopped thinking about it. Because everyone did the same. The itch was not a sign of something wrong. It was not a surprise. It was simply the quiet background rhythm of being alive in the Middle Ages. A constant little whisper on the skin. Lice were not a plague, not in the way we think of them now. They were common, ordinary, expected. They came with the season, with the heat, with the closeness of bodies, in shared beds in crowded homes. They lived in the seams of tunics, in the folds of collars, in the linen shifts worn against the skin. They tucked themselves into woolen hats and fur-lined cloaks and head coverings, finding warmth and shadow where they could. And they stayed. They multiplied. They bit, and the people scratched. Fleas, too, were everywhere. In the straw of the mattress, in the rushes on the floor, in the fur of the dog who slept at the foot of the bed. They jumped, fast and invisible, feeding and retreating, leaving behind nothing but the familiar itch. You might wake with red marks along your calves, your wrists, the inside of your thighs. You might notice them, or you might not. You might sleep through the night without complaint, and wake up scratching softly before even opening your eyes. It was normal. It was constant. And no one made much of it. Combining was one way to manage it. Wooden combs with close, narrow teeth were used, not to style, but to clear, to scrape gently along the scalp, collecting lice and their eggs. It didn't work completely. It didn't work for long. But it helped. The combing was done quietly, by firelight, or beside a window. A mother might do it for her child. A sister might do it for her sister. The nits were flicked into the hearth, or crushed between fingernails, or wrapped in a bit of cloth and burned. And then the comb was hung back on its hook, or tucked into a pouch, waiting for the next round of scratching. Sometimes the infestation was worse. The skin flaked, red and irritated. The lice crawled into the eyebrows, the eyelashes, the seams of underclothes. In those cases, the hair might be shaved off entirely. A bald head was cleaner, easier to manage. It didn't invite lice in the same way. And while not everyone could do it, and not everyone wanted to, it was known to help. Monks with their tonsures often avoided the worst of it, though their robes could still harbor fleas, and no one was truly free of them. Not entirely. Soap, if it could be found, was too harsh. The kind made for bodies was rare and expensive, and not especially gentle. Ash soap burned the skin, lye stripped it raw. Herbal powders helped a little, mint, rosemary, lavender crushed into the scalp, but they were not cures. They simply made the itching smell better. And sometimes that was enough. There were beliefs about lice that they came from sin, from sloth, from women, from foreigners, from the poor. But in truth, they came from everyone. No one was immune. Nobles scratched under jeweled collars. Priests picked at their scalps beneath their hoods. Peasants lifted their shirts to reveal the same small red marks as their masters. Children chased fleas around their knees with sticks. Dogs rolled in straw, their backs twitching. The insects did not care about class. They cared only for warmth. And there was always warmth. Still, people managed. They brushed their cloaks. They aired their bedding. They beat the mattresses with sticks. They changed their shifts when they could, and when they couldn't, they lived with a feeling, the soft, crawling presence just beneath the fabric, never fully gone. There were no repellents, no sprays, no guaranteed methods, only patience and scratching and silence. And it wasn't discussed, not openly. You didn't complain about lice in front of others, you didn't point them out. You didn't flinch when someone else scratched their arm absently during supper. It was just part of the body's quiet burden, something everyone carried, something everyone accepted. You could go years without hearing it mentioned, and still know that every head around you held the same secret discomfort. Even in death, lice were found, crawling in the folds of burial shrouds, clinging to the hair of the departed. A final reminder that they had lived, that they had been warm, that they had been human. And so the itch remained, day after day, season after season. Not enough to change a life, just enough to mark it. Even now, if you sit very still in silence and listen, really listen, you can almost hear the sound of fingernails scratching through wool, the slow scrape of a wooden comb pulled carefully through tangled hair, the soft breath of someone turning in bed, restless, as the lice shift along the scalp. No one screamed. No one wept. No one really tried to stop it. They just lived with it. And they smelled a little too, which is where we'll go next. The smell of the Middle Ages is something you feel before you understand. It arrives not all at once, not in a dramatic gust, but in layers. Quiet, dense, overlapping. It seeps into the air, into wool, into hair, into the gaps between things. It is not a stench, not always. It is not rotting meat or sewage or catastrophe. It is just there, a presence, a murmur, a living scent made of living things. Bodies, breath, smoke, earth, animals, fire, cooking fabric, feet, milk, moss, sweat, garlic, old shoes, and still water. The kind of smell you only notice if you leave it and come back. But no one ever left, so no one ever came back. It simply surrounded you, softened you, belonged to you. And after a while, you didn't notice it at all. Body odor wasn't shameful. It wasn't even really discussed. There was no expectation to prevent it. There was no word for freshness in the way we mean it now. You wore your own scent the way you wore your name, or your voice, or your breath. A little different than the person beside you. Stronger after a walk, softer after sleep, sweeter with youth, sharper with age, and entirely your own. The body simply did what bodies do. It sweated, quietly, constantly. Not just under the arms, but behind the knees, at the base of the spine, at the collar, under the breasts, between the toes. Wool held it all. Linen absorbed what it could. Leather shoes became soaked and never fully dried. No one washed every day. Few bathed more than once a month. And deodorant, as we think of it now, did not exist. Not as a concept. Not as a product. Not as a daily ritual. The body was left to manage itself, and it did. People covered smells more than they removed them. They carried herbs, dried lavender, rosemary, crushed sage, in small cloth bundles tied to their belts. They hung pomanders filled with spices from cords around their necks. They clutched sprigs of mint or hyssop during hot walks or long masses or crowded marketplaces. Not because it made them smell better, but because it gave them something else to smell. A little relief from the closeness of it all. A note of sharpness in the warm, thick air. For those who could afford it, perfume existed, but not in delicate sprays or light floral mists. It was heavy, resinous, oils rubbed into the skin, worn into the hair, clinging to the fabric of hoods and veils. It didn't erase odor, it just joined it. The scent of rose oil layered over old sweat and sun-warmed linen. The sharp bitterness of myrrh mingling with the musky depth of wool. It wasn't better, it was simply more. And more, sometimes, was all you could do. Garlic was eaten for health and for flavor, and its echo in the breath and pores was constant. The hearth fire was never truly out, and the smoke soaked into everything. Hair, clothes, skin, even teeth. People smelled like smoke, like garlic, like dried meat and cabbage and feet and dogs and sheep. They smelled like themselves. And no one questioned it. You could sleep beside someone for decades and never know what they smelled like without it. There was always something else layered on top. The rushes under the bed, the soot on the walls, the wool cloak, damp from rain, the child in your arms who hadn't yet been wiped. And it was fine, truly, because everyone else smelled the same, or close enough. Clothes were rarely washed. When they were, they returned with a faint ash scent from the lye, from the fire. Skin was washed sometimes, not every day, not every week, often just wiped. A wet cloth along the neck, behind the ears, between the fingers. That was enough. That was care. That was clean. And if it wasn't, well, what was the alternative? Scrubbing away at a scent that always came back? There were more pressing concerns. The body didn't need to be managed into something different. It just needed to keep going. And it did. Visitors to medieval towns sometimes wrote of the smell. Travelers from elsewhere or centuries later who described the scent of people packed into narrow streets, of butchers working beside bakers, of fish left open in the sun, of animals and humans sharing alleys and rooms and beds. But for those who lived there, for those who were part of it, the smell was not a single thing. It was the world. It was home. Even the animals knew it. Dogs knew their owners by scent alone. Cats nestled into piles of unwashed linen, choosing the piece that smelled most like their person. Horses followed the voice, yes, but also the sweat. A child knew their mother's smell before they knew her words. And when someone died, it wasn't their silence you noticed first, it was the absence of their smell. The room felt wrong. Colder, flatter, empty in a way you couldn't name, because something had been taken. Something only you could smell. And now, centuries later, when we imagine what it must have been like, the heaviness of it, the thickness, the closeness of bodies, we forget that it was never meant to be judged. It was never meant to be clean. It was just meant to be endured, shared, tolerated, occasionally covered with mint or myrrh, sometimes ignored completely. That was the mystery of the smell, not how bad it was, but how normal it became, how it settled into the skin, into the home, into the soul, until you couldn't tell where it ended and you began. And of course, some tried to change it, to shift it, to escape it. They rubbed powders in their hair, they wore extra layers to trap the odor in, they shaved their heads, they drank vinegar, they hung sweet herbs from rafters. But none of it lasted, because the smell always returned. Not because they were failing, but because the body was always breathing, always sweating, always living. The smell was proof of life, of effort, of being here. And so they lived inside it, not beneath it, not ashamed of it, just inside it. Every breath, every gesture, every night of sleep pressed deeper into it. And that too was normal. And so we come now to something that rested on top of that smell, that oily crown of daily discomfort, the hair. Heavy, unwashed, hidden or shaved, powdered or ignored, it was always there, sometimes clean, often not, but always present, waiting. Hair, like so many things in the medieval world, was something you lived with, not something you managed. It grew, it tangled, it itched, it hung heavy or dry, flat or coarse, tucked beneath linen or shaved entirely off. It was not styled in the way we might imagine. Not fussed over, not perfumed or primped each morning with brushes or rinses or scented mists. It was simply there, often covered, occasionally cleaned, combed when needed, cut rarely, cared for, but only in the quietest sense of the word. And it was oily, almost always oily, that dull, waxy texture that comes when scalp meets wool meets months without a wash. But it was normal. Everyone's hair had a sheen, everyone's scalp had a scent. And no one expected otherwise. A medieval morning did not begin with lather. There was no shampoo, no conditioner, no scented bars left beside copper tubs. Most people didn't own a mirror, let alone a hairbrush. And even those who did, the wealthier ones, the nobility, the courtiers, even they didn't wash their hair often. Because washing it meant washing everything. And washing everything meant boiling water, preparing cloths, building fires, carrying buckets, finding privacy. So the hair stayed dirty. Not always filthy, but dirty, oily, a little itchy, and heavy. Hair that was rarely cut grew long and tangled, and long hair needed to be tied up, pinned back, braided, or hidden away. Women covered theirs with linen veils, crisp wimples, coifs that wrapped around the neck and forehead like soft cloth armor. Men wore hoods or caps or simply let their hair fall, as it would, in waves or knots or tufts. In summer, it stuck to the skin. In winter, it helped trap warmth. Either way, it was there. never quite comfortable, never quite clean. Combing was the closest most people came to caring for their hair. The combs were wooden, hand-carved, often with two sides, wide teeth for detangling, narrow teeth for nitpicking. They were kept near the hearth or hung from belts or tucked into storage chests, passed from mother to daughter, from older brother to younger. Combing was a quiet ritual, a slow drag through thick strands, sometimes with one person sitting on the floor, head bowed, another behind them, carefully parting and clearing. It wasn't pleasant, not always. There were tangles, there was pulling, sometimes there were bugs, but it was necessary, and it was tender in its own way, a shared burden, a slow, silent kind of care. The sound of comb against scalp, soft, scraping, rhythmic, was one of the many quiet sounds of medieval life. When combing wasn't enough, people turned to powders. Crushed herbs like rosemary, lavender, or nettle were rubbed into the roots to absorb oil and mask odor. Some used stale rye flour or chalky earth for the same purpose. Others made pastes of ash and lye, though these were harsher and risked burning the skin if left too long. Wealthier households might have access to oils and balms made with beeswax or rendered animal fat, sometimes scented with clove or rose. But these were not for cleaning, they were for appearance, for gloss or protection, or keeping curls in place. And still, they didn't change the fact that most hair was not washed often. Most scalps itched a little. Most people learned to ignore it. And when ignoring it wasn't enough, when the bugs came, when the sores formed, when the tangles turned into mats, shaving was the answer. Especially for men. Monks, with their tonsures, kept a circle of bare scalp exposed to the air, not just as a sign of humility, but as a way to stay cleaner, cooler, and freer from lice. Some peasants did the same, though more often out of necessity than devotion. A shaved head could be scrubbed with vinegar or wine, rubbed with salt or nettles, then covered again with a cap. Children sometimes had their heads shaved in the summer, especially if their hair was infested. Women, however, rarely cut theirs. Long hair was tied to modesty, to marriage, to identity. And so theirs stayed, even if it itched, even if it tangled, even if no one else ever saw it. Hair was rarely seen in public, especially a woman's hair. A married woman covered her head as part of her role, her modesty, her place in the world. Even indoors among family, her hair might remain beneath a veil or cap. To be uncovered was to be exposed, not shamefully perhaps, but vulnerably. Hair was private, intimate, sacred in a quiet way. And because it was hidden, it could be dirty without comment. A veil could mask months of sweat. A hood could hide grease. A coif could press the hair down so tightly that no one ever saw it move. And so a person could go half a year without truly tending to their scalp, and no one would know. Not even themselves after a while. There were beliefs, too. Soft superstitions, half memories passed down, about what hair carried, that it held illness, that it absorbed sin, that to cut it was to weaken the soul, that to burn it was to protect it from being used in charms or curses. Hair was wrapped in cloth and buried. It was tied in knots to ward off pain. It was never thrown away carelessly. It was never left behind on pillows or floors without thought. And so it stayed mostly on the head, untouched, heavier with time, more burden than ornament. And the smell, that smell again. Damp wool and scalp oil mingled with a faint bitter scent of old lye or dried sage. It was not offensive, not surprising. It was simply part of the air. If you walked into a room full of people with unwashed hair, you didn't think anything of it. You didn't wrinkle your nose. You breathed it in, just as you breathed in smoke, sweat, straw, breath, and dust. It was the air, and you lived in it. There were festivals sometimes when people tried to look cleaner. Religious days, weddings, special feasts. Hair might be washed with warmed rainwater, or combed with care, or sprinkled with dried flower petals and braided with ribbons. But these moments were rare, exceptions. Even nobles wore their hair unwashed for weeks at a time. Even queens scratched their scalps behind silk veils. and even the best-kept court smelled of wool and flesh beneath its perfume. It wasn't a failure, it wasn't neglect. It was just a world where cleaning something meant labor, where heat meant firewood, where water meant hauling, where privacy was rare, and where the body, its oils, its hair, its smells, was something people learned to live inside. It was always slightly wrong, always slightly uncomfortable, always slightly off, but so was everything else. So was the floor, so was the food, so was the weather. The human being was just another animal in the world, not outside it, not above it, not clean in spite of it. And the hair, heavy and hidden, simply told that truth, softly, quietly, every day. And now, centuries later, we forget what it was like to carry that weight. Not just the physical weight of hair, but the sensory burden of living with it, always half damp, half tangled, half known. You didn't look in the mirror and adjust it. You didn't rinse it and feel new. You simply put on your hood, your veil, your cap, and you moved through the day, unwashed but not unloved, dirty but still dignified. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't meant to be. It just was. And sometimes when the scalp burned, when the bugs returned, when the powders failed, sometimes people gave up on washing altogether. Sometimes they said it was safer to be dirty, that cleaning made you weak, that warm water opened the skin, let illness in. And that belief, though odd to us now, shaped how people thought about bathing entirely, which is where we're going next. There is a kind of stillness that settles in old stone chapels at dawn, before the bells, before the voices, just candlelight and the soft shuffle of sandals on worn floors. The air is cool, not yet thick with breath or incense, and the walls, damp in places, chipped in others, seem to lean inward like tired shoulders. In these places, in these hours, cleanliness meant something else entirely. Not the scrubbed body, not the washed hand, but the inward cleanness, the state of the soul. And that was the kind of purity people sought most often. For much of the medieval world, water was sacred before it was sanitary. A symbol, a tool of grace. The act of washing, when it was done, was often done with more reverence than practicality. At the church door, a finger dipped into holy water. At the altar, the priest washed his hands, not for hygiene, but as a gesture, a sign of spiritual readiness. Lavabo inter innocentes manus meas, he would murmur, I will wash my hands among the innocent. The bowl was small, the water was not warm. It wasn't meant to cleanse the skin, it was meant to purify the heart, and that was enough. Or rather, it had to be. Because in a world where water was cold, hard to carry, and often murky, true physical washing was rare. But ritual washing? That was everywhere. Before prayer, you washed. Before meals, you washed. A trickle over the fingertips, not a thorough rinse. Before entering a holy space, before taking the sacrament, before burying the dead, always some gesture of water. Not to make yourself clean, but to make yourself worthy. The dirt remained. But the soul, perhaps, might be a little lighter. Monks and nuns followed rules about this, not bathing rules exactly, but rules about washing certain parts at certain times. Feet, especially, were symbolic. The washing of feet recalled Christ and his apostles. It was done on Maundy Thursday, in long, slow ceremonies that were more about humility than hygiene. Sometimes kings and queens performed it, bending to rinse the feet of the poor, not to remove dirt, but to show spiritual service, to lower themselves, to remind everyone that clean hands and clean hearts did not always live in the same body. Most people, of course, did not bathe often enough to think of water as either sacred or sanitary, but they believed in its power. Pilgrims walked for days to reach holy springs, waters blessed by saints, said to heal wounds, cure madness, cleanse sin. Some of these springs were warm, some were cold, none were truly clean. But people drank from them, bathed in them, carried them home in bottles sealed with wax and prayer. And in doing so, they believed they were washing not their bodies, but their sickness, their sorrow, their stains. To be clean, in the medieval sense, was to be in a state of grace. Not physically spotless, but spiritually aligned. Confession, penance, fasting, these were the real scrubs, the long internal rinses that scoured away guilt. And just as bathing too often was suspect, seen by some as indulgent or vain, excessive concern with bodily purity could be frowned upon. Better to be modest, better to be quietly smudged. God, after all, could see through the dirt. So people prayed, not just for salvation, but for relief, from sores, from itching, from the creeping fear of illness. Psalms were whispered over sick beds, crosses drawn in oils on the forehead, candles lit beside tubs that were rarely filled. And if someone did bathe, a rare full immersion, it might be accompanied by prayer, by incense, by the presence of a priest. Not always, but often enough to blur the line between cleaning and cleansing. Water on the body became a blessing, a plea, a slow anointing of the parts most afflicted. And sometimes people washed only after death. The final washing, done in silence, a cloth dipped in water, holy if possible, passed over closed eyes, bloodless lips, cold limbs. This was the washing that mattered most, the one that readied the soul for judgment, the one that sent a person out of the world with the dignity they rarely knew in life. The rest of the time, they stayed dusty, smoked, soiled. But the soul, they hoped might shine. This spiritual idea of cleanliness had deep roots, deeper than Christian doctrine, older than the church. In many older customs, water was always sacred. The rivers had names, the springs had voices. Bathing was a rite of passage, a way to mark transitions from child to adult, from single to wed, from sinner to forgiven. But over time the spiritual remained and the practical faded. Bathing became rare. Washing became symbolic. Cleanliness became something you carried in your heart. Which is why, even in the dirtiest parts of the medieval world, there was a strange sense of pride in remaining unwashed. Not because they loved the smell or the feel of sweat, but because to care too much for the body was a kind of vanity. To fuss, to perfume, to polish, it was a distraction, a danger. Better to stay simple, plain, dusty, but devout. And when one did seek cleanliness beyond prayer, it was often disguised, tucked into routine, hidden under layers of meaning. A splash of rosewater before Mass, a change of tunic on a holy feast day, a few drops of lavender in the corner of a pillowcase, not for scent, but for sleep. Cleanliness was not announced, it was suggested, implied, and sometimes imagined. But imagined things matter, especially when they comfort us. And in a world where dirt clung to every hem and hair, the belief that your soul could be clean, could remain untouched by the sweat, the sores, the lice, was a kind of survival. A soft defiance. You could be ill, you could be unwashed, but still pure, still blessed, still whole. And so people lived inside that paradox, dirty but dignified, smelling of smoke but praying with folded hands, surrounded by filth but dreaming of light. Their bodies remained heavy, their clothes remained damp, their feet cracked, their scalps itched, but their prayers were clean. And sometimes that was all they had. And when they needed more, something tangible, something fragrant, something they could wear, they turned to other comforts. Not soap, not water, but scent, perfume. Pomanders hung from belts, pressed to lips, held in the sleeve during long church services. A different kind of clean. A scented mask. A balm for the space between the body and the world. Which is what we'll drift into next. There's something gentle about scent, the way it drifts quietly, never demanding much. It doesn't scrub like soap. It doesn't scrape like lye. It simply hovers around the wrists, behind the ears, inside folds of cloth and shadow. In the medieval world, where water was scarce and sweat was constant, this was the nearest thing most people had to feeling clean. Not being clean, but smelling something else instead. And so they carried scent with them. Not in bottles, not always, but in pouches, beads, branches, bits of cloth soaked in oils. They tied them to belts, hung them around their necks, tucked them in sleeves and bodices, in hoods and under pillows. These were not decorations, they were protections. against disease, against bad air, against the thick closeness of other unwashed bodies. A soft defense made of rosemary, lavender, clove, cinnamon, rose. The pomander was a favorite. Small, round, hollow. A metal orb, sometimes plain, sometimes ornate, that opened into chambers, each one filled with something fragrant. Dried herbs, pressed petals, a resinous paste of ground spices and fat. You wore it on a chain or held it in the hand. In a crowded market or on a packed church bench, you might lift it to your face, not dramatically, just a soft gesture, a shield between you and the world. The air was not always foul, but it was never fresh, so people carried a little sweetness with them, like a whisper of something cleaner. And there were oils too, though only the wealthier had them. Rose oil, if you could afford it, or elderflower, sometimes spikenard, sometimes violet. These weren't perfumes in the modern sense, not crisp, not layered, not preserved in alcohol. They were oily, earthy, faint, more like memory than scent. You dabbed a little on your fingertips, maybe your temples, and let it mix with your natural musk, your old wool, the smoke that never quite left your cloak. It didn't mask everything. It couldn't. But it softened the edges, made you feel almost not dirty. Almost. And then there were sachets, simple cloth pouches stuffed with whatever you had, dried mint, marjoram, lemon balm, sage. Women made them at home, hung them near beds, hid them inside their husbands' boots, tied them into their children's sleeves before festivals or fasts. Scent became an act of care. A quiet one. You didn't need to be clean, exactly. But it helped if you didn't smell like illness. Because scent, in those days, was more than a pleasantry. It was part of survival. People believed that bad air, miasma, carried disease, that the stench of rot and filth didn't just offend the nose, but entered the body and made it sick. So if you could carry sweet smells with you, perhaps you could guard yourself. A clove-stuffed orange might keep the plague away. A sprig of rosemary might block the black bile. A pomander pressed to your face might shield your lungs from all the things that lurked in the breath of strangers. Of course, none of this truly worked, but it helped people feel protected. And comfort, even false comfort, has power, so they clung to their scented charms. They buried the dead with sachets, hung branches of juniper above the sick, scattered herbs on floors to freshen the air, or at least to cover what couldn't be helped. And when someone entered a room smelling faintly of myrrh or frankincense or marigold, they were noticed, not as clean, but as cared for, as someone trying. Even the church, wary of vanity, allowed scent its place. Incense wafted through services, heavy and thick, curling around pillars and altars. It sanctified space, made even a smoke-blackened chapel feel somehow bright. And it served a practical purpose, too, masking the odor of too many bodies kneeling in close quarters, sweating into linen and leather. The same incense used for blessing could also, in its own way, cover up the world, but not for long. Scent didn't last. The oils faded, the herbs crumbled, the flowers browned, and underneath always was the same sourness, of skin, of smoke, of slow decay. That's what the body was in those days. Not repulsive, exactly, just constant. Close, unwashed, and no perfume, no matter how lovingly applied, could change that for more than a moment. Still they tried, because trying mattered, and because scent, fleeting as it was, gave the illusion of control. A woman might not be able to bathe, but she could crush mint between her fingers and rub it behind her ears. A man might wear the same tunic for weeks, but he could hang a sprig of thyme in his collar and breathe it when the streets grew too sharp with refuse. These were not great gestures. They were small, tired, but they made life just slightly more bearable. And perhaps most telling, they were quiet. No one announced their perfume. No one spoke of how sweet their pomander smelled. Scent was private, close to the skin, like a secret, like hope. And in a time when hope was often thin, these little comforts, no matter how ineffective, were held close. Not as solutions, but as soft illusions. Sweet air in a sour world. Even royalty, with their wealth and access, didn't truly smell clean, but they smelled different. Their clothes might be rubbed with ambergris or civet, animalic, musky substances we might now call unpleasant, but which then were prized for their potency. They didn't smell like the streets. They smelled like power, like something you couldn't reach. That was the closest thing they had to modern luxury, a different kind of stink. And when people could no longer afford perfumes or oils, they made do. Burned rosemary on coals, tied fresh rushes around the legs of tables, hung dried flowers from rafters. The scent didn't linger long, but neither did anything else. Except the dirt. Which brings us back, always, to that central discomfort, that nothing really stayed clean. Not the air, not the body, not the home. But still people softened the edges. They lit herbs on feast days, anointed the sick with scented balm, crushed petals between the fingers before bed. Not to escape the dirt, but to live inside it more gently. And gently is how we'll leave them. Wrapped in wool, breathing through lavender, drifting toward the part of the night where even the worst smells seem far away. And what comes next is even quieter, more secret, more hushed. The parts of hygiene kept in whispers, behind doors, between women. That's what we'll visit next. There were things not spoken, not written down, not passed along in sermons or songs, not because they were forbidden, just because they were quiet. Private. The kind of knowledge that moved hand to hand, whispered between women, taught in corners, not classrooms. The world of women's hygiene in the Middle Ages was not invisible, but it lived behind doors, beneath layers, in the hush between cores. And for most women, it was something they simply managed. Not comfortably, not easily, but constantly. The female body did not pause for the season, or the harvest, or the feast day. It bled, it ached, it changed. And in a world without plumbing, without soap, without silence, that body had to adapt to what little it was given, and to what little it could speak of. When a girl first bled, there might be no warning, no prepared words, just a stain, a shock, a sudden weight, and perhaps a sister, or a mother, or a neighbor would step close. Not with celebration, not always with warmth, but with instructions. Cloth, rags, linen, folded thick and tucked against the skin. Sometimes moss, soft, absorbent, gathered carefully and dried. Sometimes wool, wrapped tight and pinned in place. These were the pads of the time. No straps, no adhesives, just what could be made, washed, reused, again and again. Cleanliness was never total, and that was understood. There were stains, quietly scrubbed from underdresses, hidden beneath aprons, washed in rivers when no one was looking, drying slowly by the fire, turned inward so no one could see. There was no shame in bleeding, not officially. The church taught that it was natural. But still, it wasn't spoken of. It wasn't polite. It was something to manage in silence. There were days women didn't leave the house, not because they were unwell, but because they were unready. They sat by hearths sewing or spinning, shifting their weight now and then. They stayed close to the fire, not for warmth, but for the privacy of shadows. And when they did move about, when they worked, fetched water, ground grain, tended gardens, they walked with the careful, slow gait of someone containing more than they could speak. The discomfort was constant, not dramatic, just there. A weight, a wetness, a rawness. Woolen underthings chafed, linen dried stiff, and all the while the body kept moving, milking, cooking, sweeping, kneeling. Pain was normal, and so, mostly, it went unmentioned. Pregnancy and childbirth, too, carried their own quiet rituals of hygiene, few of them clean, none of them easy. Midwives washed their hands in wine or vinegar if they had the means. Cloths were boiled if they had the time. But mostly, birth was messy, sacred, and ordinary. Babies arrived in beds of straw, on floorboards, in small dark rooms with prayers muttered between contractions. Afterward, the mother was swaddled, not in softness, but in layers, to hold heat, to stop bleeding, to feel somehow contained. There was a practice called churching, a blessing offered to women after childbirth when they were ready to return to communal worship. It was less about being clean and more about being reintroduced. A ceremonial reentry after bleeding, after healing, after silence. But not everyone could wait that long. Some returned too soon. Some never left their beds. Some simply did what they could, with what they had, washing slowly, between chores, between cries, between prayers. Older women taught the younger, not always kindly, not always gently, but with care. They shared tricks, how to fold linen for less chafing, how to soak cloth in vinegar to mask odor, how to rest when rest was impossible. They knew what herbs helped cramping, mugwort, chamomile, yarrow. They knew what to do when the flow didn't stop, or when it never came at all. And through it all, hygiene was a matter of management, not perfection. A woman might change her cloth only once a day, not for lack of wanting but for lack of cloth. Water had to be fetched, boiled, used wisely. Firewood was scarce, ashes had to be swept, children cried, bread had to be baked. There was no time, no space, no solitude for tender routines. Only practicality, only what worked. And so women endured, quietly. They lived inside wool, inside stains, inside discomfort. They leaned against door frames with their arms folded across their middles. They pressed warm bricks to their stomachs when they could. They scrubbed with lye. They rinsed with vinegar. They waited for it to pass. And when it did, each month, each cycle, each season, they folded the cloth, cleaned the basin, and said nothing. Not because it wasn't hard, but because it was always hard. And because there was still spinning to do, still fields to glean, still floors to sweep. The smell, too, was managed. Not masked entirely, just softened. Herbs were burned. Sage, mostly, sometimes mint, sometimes sweet rushes scattered across the hearth or sewn into pouches and tied at the waist. The scent wasn't strong, just enough to confuse the air, to make it seem like everything was fine. There were accidents, of course, public ones. A stain on a bench, a wince while standing. And still, silence. Eyes looked away. Women offered shawls without words. Men pretended not to notice. It was easier that way. Easier to let the discomfort pass like weather, to treat it as a natural thing, because it was, and because pretending helped. In convents, among nuns, things were a little different. There was less movement, more routine. Some orders kept linen cloths on hand for monthly use. Some had midwives among them. Some practiced stricter washing rituals, done not with luxury, but with order. Still, even there, in those cloistered rooms, pain lingered. The cycle remained. And for all the silence, there were moments of softness. A friend bringing a warm cloth, a mother brushing hair away from a pale face, a sister slipping a bit of lavender into a pocket. There was no comfort in abundance, but there was comfort in intention. In the quiet way women looked after one another when no one else did. And so it went. Year after year, body after body. The stains faded, the cloths wore thin, the girls grew up, and the women grew older, and eventually the bleeding stopped. But the silence did not, because by then it was part of them. And even now, in the records and ledgers and letters they left behind, their hygiene lives in gaps, in things not said. But we can see it, if we look closely, in the worn corners of household accounts, in the laundry lists, in the scraps of linen reused too many times, in the footnotes of lives spent enduring. And so we leave them now, in their quiet rooms, their folded cloths, their slowly cooling fires, with lavender tucked under the pillow, with chamomile steeping in a cracked cup. Not clean, but cared for. And tomorrow will come again. And tomorrow brings with it a new kind of discomfort. Not from silence, but from superstition. Not from being too dirty, but from being too clean. That's where we'll drift next. There is a kind of irony in the past, slow and soft like a sigh, that the closer you got to cleanliness, the more people feared you might die from it. That to wash the body, to soften the skin, to open the pores and feel warm again, was not always seen as a blessing. Sometimes it was a warning, a risk, a quiet kind of mistake. Because once, in the long medieval centuries, it was not the filth that frightened people, it was the bath. You see, they believed something that made a certain sleepy sense, that the body, when scrubbed and heated and freshly rinsed, was somehow open, that a bath might make you feel better, but it left your insides vulnerable. The pores after a hot soak were thought to widen, to stretch apart, and through them, through those soft and unseen holes, the world might enter. Cold air, bad air, foul humors, miasma, that drifting sickness carried on invisible wings. The very thing you were trying to wash away could slip inside you now, through skin made tender by heat, through blood warmed by steam. The bath wasn't healing. Not always. It could be a door. And so, hygiene became a balancing act, one that tilted slowly toward fear. There were still bathhouses, of course, and people still used them, especially in earlier centuries. But over time, the ideas shifted. Cleanliness might be pleasant, but safety, that came from staying sealed, layered, dry. Better to keep your skin a little dusty, better to keep your tunic on, better not to open yourself. The very word pore held mystery. They didn't see them, not really, but they knew the body had pathways, channels, leaky places. And when those places were disturbed by a bath, by wind, by emotion, illness could follow. Fevers, flux, fainting spells. Something soft might enter you that would never quite leave. And so some physicians advised against frequent bathing. Not just in winter, but always, especially for the weak, especially for women, especially for children. The old medical texts, some Latin, some Greek, some patched together by monastic scribes in cold scriptoria, whispered the same warning. Bathing thins the body, softens the constitution, draws bad humors to the surface. And so a paradox formed. People wanted to feel clean, but feared what came with it. A quick wash of hands, perhaps. A cool cloth to the neck. But a full soak? A steaming bathhouse? That was not something you did lightly. Even those who braved the water took precautions. Some rubbed themselves with oils or powders after bathing, not for scent, but to seal the skin, to close the gates again, to armor the body in a thin layer of something. Others wrapped tightly in wool, avoided the night air, drank spiced wine to heat the belly so that the outside cold could not rush in through their softened skin. A hot bath in winter was especially risky. You might feel comforted, but then, a breeze through the window, a step onto cold stone, and something could shift inside you. A cough might begin, a chill that never fully left. They had no names for viruses, no sense of what illness truly was. But they understood weakness. They understood what it meant to suddenly feel worse. And when that happened after a bath, the conclusion felt natural. The bath had done it. The bath had made you soft. Even religious institutions picked up on the fear. Some monks bathed rarely and only out of necessity, to cleanse the body before death, perhaps, or to prepare for feast days, but not often, not luxuriously, not with pleasure. Pleasure was suspicious, and warmth, the kind that seeps into your bones, that leaves you sleepy and pink, that was too close to vulnerability, too much like sin or sickness. And yet, people didn't stop washing entirely. They just washed differently, with cloths, not tubs, with vinegar and wine, with rosewater or scented infusions, a little dab behind the ears, a small rinse of the hands, enough to feel almost fresh, but not so much as to tempt fate. The fear of bathing wasn't constant. It came in waves, tied to outbreaks of plague, to sudden chills, to seasons when illness clung to the town like fog. When people saw neighbors fall sick after visiting the bathhouse, the cause seemed clear. Not the germs, not the crowd, but the bath itself. It had opened them up, and the air had entered. Some cities shuttered their bathhouses during epidemics. Not because the water was unclean, it was often shared, often reused, but because the act of bathing itself was risky. People grew still in the heat, relaxed, vulnerable, and that was not safe. A hot bath could be deadly, or so it was said, and soon fewer people bothered. The decline of bathing wasn't dramatic, just slow. Bathhouses fell quiet. Tubs were used for laundry, for curing meat, for steeping herbs. Bodies stayed dry. Faces were rinsed, perhaps. But the full soaking? That became something you remembered, or feared, or whispered about, as something people once did. Still, the desire for cleanliness never disappeared. It lingered, quietly, in the way someone might run a damp cloth over their arms before a feast, in the way a mother might warm water for her child just enough to touch, but always carefully, always quickly, just in case. And so, hygiene became a ritual of avoidance, washing just enough to stay presentable, but never so much as to feel exposed. A strange kind of cleanliness. One that wore clothes. One that stayed dry. One that feared its own purpose. And as you picture it now, the dim bathhouse, its fires banked low, steam curling through rafters no longer crowded, you might feel a little chilled too. A little like stepping out of warm water into cold stone. A little too clean in a world that wasn't ready for it. But soon, things would change again. Something would come that made the fear of being clean seem small. A sickness so vast, so sudden, that it rewrote the rules entirely. It made perfume a weapon, made vinegar a prayer, made scent and breath and air itself a kind of battlefield. That's what comes next. You might imagine the medieval home as something still and quiet. Stone walls, a wooden door, perhaps a hearth smoldering gently, and a family drowsing near the fire. But that picture, while not untrue, is missing something. Or rather, many somethings. Feathers, fur, teeth, tails, the heavy cluck of hens scratching near the firewood, the soft padding of a dog curled under the bed, the long silence broken by a sudden bleat or the flap of wings. Because in the medieval home, animals weren't outside. Not really. Not always. They were inside, with you, around you, beneath you. They were warmth and food and work and noise. They were part of the room, part of the life, and in their quiet way, part of the mess. It begins with the floor. There were no tiles, no polished wood, just earth packed and cool, sometimes strewn with straw, or rushes, long, dry reeds spread across the surface to soften footsteps, to muffle sound, to soak up what might fall. But straw does not stay clean. It catches crumbs, spills, the mud from boots and hooves alike. It soaks up milk, ale, chamber pot sloshes, the occasional trickle from a restless infant or an old dog that can no longer be bothered to rise. And it stays. Weeks, sometimes months, before it is swept up and replaced. The clean layered over the stale, like time piling itself in thin, itchy layers. Chickens wandered freely, pecking at whatever they found. Dried peas, beetle shells, discarded crusts. They'd roost in corners, up in beams, beneath benches. Dogs came and went. Some were working animals, barkers, chasers, herders. Some were companions of a kind. Small dogs curled beside women as they spun thread. Large ones curled near the doors, half asleep but alert to the outside wind. None of them were bathed. Cats lived too close to be wild, and too independent to be pets. They kept to shadows, to rafters, to piles of grain. They ate mice, they ignored commands, and they never once asked to be let in, because they were never truly out. In colder months, animals were often brought inside deliberately. Cows, goats, pigs. They shared space, heat, breath. The body warmth of a cow could soften a winter night. A goat might be tied near the hearth, bleeding quietly through the long dark. Pigs snuffled at the base of the stairs, grunting in their dreams. These animals were not caged or separate. They simply lived where you lived, and with them came their leavings. Hoof prints in soft mud, droppings swept casually toward the door. The faint, constant scent of dung, not sharp, but present, underneath everything, like smoke, like wool, like time. Even the air was thick. The breath of humans, of animals, of stews long simmering, of chamber pots too full, of damp wool drying too slowly. All of it hovered together, in low ceilings, in thick thatch. There was no such thing as fresh air, not in the sense we know. Only the smell of the season, frost or rot or flowers crushed underfoot, mixing with the breath of beasts. In grander houses, things were separated at least a little. Stables were adjacent, not inside. Chickens had yards. Dogs had duties. But even then, animals roamed. Horses might be walked through courtyards, leaving behind steaming piles. Falcons perched on leather-wrapped fists, dropping feathers in the hall. Cats were prized for keeping storerooms free of mice. Still, the line between human and animal space was more porous than we imagine. And at night, when fires were banked low and the room fell into soft, flickering dark, the sounds changed. A pig shifted its weight. A dog whined in its sleep. Mice rustled behind the walls. Someone stirred, coughed, rolled over. A baby cried. A rooster, confused by the moonlight, crowed too early. The home was never silent, because it was never empty. And in this full flickering space, hygiene was never a priority. It wasn't that people didn't care. It was that they were outnumbered. By creatures, by smells, by the soft tide of daily waste that came from living with so many small bodies, so many mouths, so many lives. There were brooms, of course, buckets, lye for scrubbing, if you could spare it. But no one expected clean in the modern sense. They expected livable. And that line moved depending on the season, depending on how many animals you kept, depending on whether the pigs had come inside yet. And perhaps there was comfort in that, a kind of closeness, a reminder that humans were never really apart from animals. Not then, not really. They breathed the same air, slept under the same roof, walked across the same straw, shared the same fleas. Because yes, where the animals went, the insects followed. Lice didn't distinguish between man and dog. Fleas leapt from goats to beds without hesitation. Mites lived in feathers. Beetles hid in straw. The human body was simply one more warm, breathing surface. No more, no less. Still, they endured. They swept. They scolded the chickens. They shooed the cats from the stew pot. They wrapped the children tight at night, hoping to keep them dry, warm, unbitten. They knew it was messy, but it was home. And when dawn came, with its dim light and cold stones and clucking and coughing, they rose into it again, stepping onto straw soaked not just with rainwater, but with time. They opened the door to let in the animals, or to let them out. It hardly mattered which, and that's simply how things were. But soon, very soon, something would shift. The animals would not be the danger anymore. Something else would come. Something so strange, so invisible, that even the most ordinary filth would begin to seem dangerous. Even the straw would start to look suspicious. Even the air. And that's where we drift next. By now you know the scent of medieval life. It hangs heavy. It clings. Smoke from the hearth. Sweat from the skin. Wool damp from weather. Bread just beginning to mold. The world was full, crowded, layered. People lived close. Close to animals. Close to filth. Close to one another. But they did not worry. Not much. Not until the air changed. Not until the plague. It arrived not with a scream, but with silence. First, a merchant fell ill. Then his servant. Then the servant's sister, and the man she sold bread to, and the boy who helped lift the sack of grain. It moved like smoke, like breath. You could not see it. You could not catch it. But it was there. And suddenly, everything mattered. Everything felt dangerous. The air you breathed, the hand you touched, the cup you drank from, the rushes beneath your feet, the damp cloth you held to your face. Cleanliness, which had always been a loose, flexible thing, became sharper. It meant survival, or the hope of it. The Black Death changed the world, not with knowledge but with panic. And in that panic, people turned to what they had. Herbs, vinegar, prayer, fire. Perfume became protection. The strong, sweet scent of cloves, the sharp sting of rosemary, the sour breath of vinegar. They believed that illness came from bad air, not germs, not contact, but a foulness that hovered, invisible and deadly, in places where people coughed or cried or died, so they fought it with smell. Pomanders, small balls filled with herbs, carried on belts or cords, became a kind of armor. Bundles of lavender, thyme, mint, and sage were hung in windows, tucked into robes, pressed into palms. The plague doctor's mask, long and bird-like, eerie in its shape, was packed with fragrant things, to keep the air out, to keep the soul in. No one wanted to breathe what the sick had breathed, and people washed, but not with soap, not in tubs, not in warm, luxurious water. They washed with vinegar, with wine, with mixtures that burned, that stung. They scrubbed their hands, their faces, the legs of the tables, the handles of spoons. They didn't know what they were fighting, so they fought everything. Some lit fires indoors, believing that smoke could cleanse the room, that heat could chase away death. Others fumed herbs, rosemary, rue, wormwood, letting the thick scent fill every space. Even silence changed. Where once there was the noise of markets, bells, children, now quiet. Empty streets, locked churches, doors painted with signs. No one trusted the air. Fumigation was common. Rooms were emptied, scrubbed, then filled with bitter smoke. Fabrics were doused with vinegar and hung in the sun. Letters were passed through flames before being read. Coins were left in jars of oil. If someone died, everything they touched was considered cursed, or dangerous, or both. Cleanliness, that old hazy habit, now felt like magic. A spell against the invisible. People changed their routines. They avoided others. They covered their faces. They stayed away from water that felt too shared, too touched. Bathhouses closed, taverns emptied. Pilgrims walked alone. But not everyone followed the rules. Some believed the plague was punishment, for sin, for pride, for the unclean soul. And so they didn't clean the body. Instead, they prayed harder, flogged themselves, slept in dirt, covered mirrors, whispered psalms in rooms that smelled of sweat and fear. Others drank, danced, hugged strangers, laughed at the edge of madness. If the world was ending, they would end it loudly, but even they eventually quieted. And in that quiet, people died. The smell of death changed the cities. It was not the rot that frightened them. They were used to that. It was the quantity. The speed. There were not enough cloths to wrap the bodies, not enough carts to carry them, not enough priests to say the words. So they turned again to scent, to herbs, to ritual. The poor held crushed garlic to their mouths. The wealthy lit incense until the rooms were choked with smoke. Vinegar was poured across thresholds. No one knew what worked. They just did it anyway. Because when you don't understand something, you grasp what you can. You wash your hands. You close the windows. You light the rosemary. You breathe through linen soaked in wine and hope it holds the world out, just long enough. And then as suddenly as it came, the plague would pass. For a while, it always came back, years later, decades later, but the first time left a scar. Not just in numbers, but in habit, in breath, in the way people thought about air and water and each other. Hygiene would never mean quite the same thing again. Even after the plague faded, some practices remained. People were wary of closeness. Some still carried herbs, some still washed with vinegar, just in case. The fear of dirt had changed, not because they understood it better, but because they had felt what happened when they ignored it. Still, the world drifted back. Slowly, bathhouses reopened, tables were shared, children played in the streets. But something lingered, not always visible, just beneath the skin. A kind of memory made of breath and smoke and rosemary. And that brings us to the end of something, or nearly. Because after the panic faded, after the vinegar dried, people returned to something older. To habits and smells and straw on the floor. The world was not clean. Not really. But it was familiar again, and there is comfort in that, even if it itches. We returned to that in the end, one last time. The vinegar dried. The herbs wilted. The plague moved on, as quietly as it had come. It did not leave a clean world behind, only an exhausted one. A world that had tried to understand what could not be seen and failed. That had scrubbed and smoked and perfumed and still watched loved ones disappear. So slowly, gently it let go. It stopped fighting the air. The bathhouses did not reopen all at once. Some remained shut forever, their warm stone rooms cold and echoing. The churches whispered less about sin, less about dirt. And the people, weary and thin and full of private ghosts, began again. They swept out the rushes. They lit the fire. They drew water, not for cleansing, but for boiling cabbage. Life, after plague, had to return to itself. And so it did. Back to tunics worn too long, to feet wrapped in rags, to the smell of sheep's wool hung by the hearth, still faintly sour from rain, back to the scrape of dry hands against rough bread, the morning rinse, not for cleanliness, but to chase the sleep from your eyes, the same chipped basin, the same cold water. Cleanliness was still a word, but it had frayed. People no longer washed out of fear. They washed when they could, where they could if they remembered, but mostly they didn't. They were not lazy, they were simply tired, and the world itself seemed to agree. Dirt returned, not in defiance but in quiet, under the nails, in the bend of the elbow, in the seams of woolen sleeves. Animals wandered freely again. Dogs beneath the table, chickens in doorways. The floors were layered in straw once more, a thick and whispering mulch of lives lived indoors. Familiar, if not fresh. Children played in mud. Women dried cloth on bushes heavy with dust. Men leaned on carts, scratching their beards, unaware of lice. Soap was used sparingly. Water was precious. The routine slipped back into place like old shoes, slightly too small, slightly too worn, but shaped to the foot. The memory of the plague lived on, but like all memories, it softened. And even that strange, brief age of frantic cleaning began to seem excessive. A bit foolish, perhaps. They laughed gently at the masks and herbs, not unkindly, just sleepily. The way one laughs at something you no longer believe in, though a part of you still wonders. And so, medieval life went on, in the way it always had, in small acts, in little discomforts, a tunic stiff with old sweat, a pot scrubbed with sand and not quite rinsed, a scratch behind the ear that didn't go away, the occasional bath when the weather allowed and the river was not too full, or too low, or too far. Cleanliness never left, it just stopped being important, not more important than warmth, than bread, than prayer. Not more important than getting through another day in a house that smelled like smoke and meat and mud and wool and time. They tried, they really did. They boiled their linen when they could. They combed their hair with wooden teeth. They swished vinegar in their mouths before prayer. They swept the rushes, not because they were dirty, but because they were old. And when the straw was fresh again, the room felt better. Not cleaner, just better. Maybe that's all they ever wanted. Not a world of soap and antiseptic. Just a world that didn't itch, a bed that didn't crawl, a pot that didn't stink, a breeze that didn't carry fear, clean enough, good enough, enough. And then, with no fanfare, no invention, no miracle, the world changed. Slowly. Cities grew taller, streets were paved, glass windows, linen shirts, imported spices, and with that came new habits, new expectations. Cleanliness, real cleanliness, would come later, but not yet. For now, the world settled back into its dust, into its soft, smudged, slightly sour self, into the quiet, unfinished effort of people who did not yet know what a germ was, but knew the satisfaction of a freshly scrubbed pot and the comfort of warm water poured over tired feet. And so we leave them there, not clean, not filthy, just somewhere in between, in the straw, in the smoke, in the same tunic worn for the third week. Asleep beneath a wool blanket that smells faintly of the goat who once wore it. They are gone now. But they were human. And they tried, that's enough.